Okay, well, good evening again. Thank you all for joining us. I wanted to first state that, of course, this is, Honest Conversations About Racism 2.0. All right, some of you have been with us for the previous two sessions, and hopefully you will enjoy this evening and then join us for the next three sessions that we have. This evening session, we're going to be discussing economic development. And next slide, please. So most of you were with us during the first Honest Conversations About Racism series, which occurred during last year's Lenten program. And what we want to do in HCAR 2.0 is to continue to open our hearts and minds to people of all races as we work individually and as a community to end the evil of racism, while we engage parishioners of St. John's and other brothers and sisters in Christ, as we have people from other parishes joining us in a journey of learning and action. So this evening, next slide, my name is Natasha Bias, and along with Donna Zagar, Terry Zagar, and Liz Moriello, we're going to be presenting this evening's session and the content for the session. But the goal of this evening's session is to review historical factors which contributed to the continued existence of the racial wealth gap between African Americans and whites in the United States, and to discuss the associated differences in economic opportunity based on race. And before we begin, Don is going to lead us in our opening prayer.
He's on mute.
I'll start. It's Donna and Terry, you all are on mute. Okay, I will start it. Oh.
All right, let's try this again. Sorry about that.
Sorry.
There you go.
Okay, we will now say a prayer that was written by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We will mute ourselves as we pray together. When our eyes do not see the gravity of racial justice, shake us from our slumber and open our eyes, O Lord. When we fear we are frozen into inaction, give us a spirit of bravery, O Lord. When we try our best but say the wrong things, give us a spirit of humility, O Lord. When the chaos of this dies down, give us a lasting spirit of solidarity, O Lord. When it becomes easier to point fingers outwards, help us to examine our own hearts, O Lord. God of truth, in your wisdom, enlighten us. God of hope, in your kindness, heal us. Creator of all people, in your generosity, guide us. Amen. And again, that was a prayer that was written by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Next slide, please. Agreement. We felt that it was important to have an agreement so that everyone can feel safe and comfortable in sharing honest conversations with each other. Our first point would be to stay open. Everyone's experiences are unique and we can learn from each other. We collaborate virtually. We share our voice equally. We be fully present to each other and allow others the opportunity to share equally. We respect our confidentiality. After our time together, we can share valuable ideas with the group, but not people's names. We will listen fully to each other. We will fully focus on group members when they are speaking and not be distracted by our phones or computers. We will extend grace to one another because we are all carrying burdens. We will be visible to each other. We remain on screen as much as possible during the breakout sessions, unless that's very challenging for you, and that's okay if it is. We will embrace one another's company and perspectives. If you feel you are unable to agree with these, we respectfully ask that you sign off now and view the presentation on our parish website. Next slide, please. We will have an agenda where we will show slides of the presentation. We will have a content section where we will stay muted and save our questions for breakout sessions. You can jot down brief notes about things that you find especially striking. In the breakout sections, which will be private, they won't be recorded. They will be led by a facilitator and structured around
It's different.
discussion questions.
Yeah, I don't know where to go from here.
I'm sorry, what? There will be a parking lot for any hard questions you may have or requests for further information. There will be a group sharing where we would talk about taking action. Everything in the presentation, except for the breakout sessions and group sharing, will be recorded and made available on St. John's website along with the slides.
So it's useful to begin our session this evening on economic development within the U.S. African American community with a review of the early history of slavery on this continent. The number of enslaved people grew from 20 or so in 1619, when the first enslaved people were brought to what was then British North America, to approximately 4 million by 1863, at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln. There are basically 5 drivers for the growth in slavery in the US and well in the country. The first driver was the legal doctrine established in 1662 in Virginia that the children of an enslaved mother were also to be considered as enslaved. This was known as partus sequitur ventrum, or literally the offspring follows the womb. There was no hope for a better life for their children or their children's children. The second driver was the ongoing international slave trade and slave ships coming to this continent. Despite a US federal act prohibiting the importation of slaves, which was enacted in 1808, as established by the Continental Congress, which prohibited slave ships from entering the US, still the domestic population of enslaved people in the US continued to grow, to include through forcible means. The third major driver, which was really discussed during our Honest Conversations 2.0 session on voting, increased enslaved populations meant more seats in the US House of Representatives and hence a source of political power for Southern states. There was no political incentive in the South to end slavery. Oops. So the fourth driver, enslaved people were basically a source of cheap labor. Black labor has been foundational to the growth of America and to the US economy. Prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, enslaved Black labor built the country's early infrastructure and produced lucrative commodities such as cotton and tobacco. In fact, between 1801 and 1835 alone, US cotton exports grew from only 100,000 bales to more than 1 million, comprising half of all the US exports, such that cotton became the backbone of the Southern economy and a significant source of profit. A single bale of hay, just for reference, or bale of cotton, was 480 pounds. And so 1 million bales, you can imagine how much that represented. And also the introduction of the cotton gin provided the ability to process more cotton bales per year. And that also drew the demand for increased slave holdings. The fifth and final driver was each enslaved person had a commodity value. This chart indicates the average price of an enslaved person was generally increasing over time as demand for slaves increased. These enslaved individuals were then subject to trade between slave owners. The economic price per slave to the slaveholder in 1860 was on average $1,000, or close to $4 billion in total. That was more than the combined value of all of the banks, all the railroads, all the factories in the US, the total US at that time. Domestic slave trade also provided cash profits from the sale of slaves. Basically, Black people were treated as a commodity rather than as human beings. And slave owners themselves were incentivized to increase their slave holdings and to use their slave holdings as collateral for debts. In fact, the value of a slave owner's slaves exceeded the value of the owner's land, dwellings, and equipment all put together.
All right, this chart gives a comprehensive overview of the white-black wealth gap from 1860 to 2020. In this chart, you can see that after the Civil War, the wealth gap decreased rapidly due to the increase in Black wealth from absolutely nothing to something. Then the gap continued to decrease, followed by a stagnation and an increase in the early 1900s, when more barriers were put in place. In the 1980s, though, through the 2020s, the gap stagnates and then begins to widen. And we'll be taking a look at the reasons for this in our presentation this evening. I'd also like to bring forth a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., who says, "It's all right to tell a man to lift himself up by his own bootstraps, but it is a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself up by his own bootstraps." So I'd like to center that quote for us this evening. In 1865, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman enacted a field measure that we see today as 40 acres and a mule. It was a wartime order giving land belonging to former Confederates to those who had been enslaved. And slaves were promised 40 acres of land to build an economic future for themselves. And there were three parts to this field order. The first talked about where the land would be, and it says, the islands from Charleston south, the abandoned rice fields along the rivers for 30 miles back from the sea, and the country bordering the St. Johns River, Florida, are reserved and set apart for the settlement of the Negroes, now made free by the acts of war and the proclamation of the President of the United States. The second part said that the new communities would be governed entirely by the Black people themselves. And the third section specified the allocation of land, that each family should have a plot of not more than 40 acres of tillable land. But as you see, in May 1865, President Andrew Johnson reversed Sherman's order and returned the land back to the white ex-Confederate landowners in return for oath of loyalty to the United States.
We're going to discuss some economic moves and counter moves, and the reason why it's been captured that way is that you'll see that there were some steps forward and then steps are taken back. And so the economic moves and counter moves in the aftermath of the Civil War. First was the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau in March of 1865. And this was established by Congress, and it established the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, also known as the Freedmen's Bureau, allowing Southern Blacks to lease abandoned and confiscated land with a yearly rent of 6% or less of the land's value. And then after 3 years, these new landowners would have the option to purchase this land at full price. Also, the Bureau created the Freedmen's Bank. The Freedmen's Bureau, during the years of its operation, was very important in trying to, one, feed millions of not only newly freed enslaved persons, but also other people who were in the war. But they built hospitals, like it was called Freedmen's Hospital, which is now Howard University Hospital, created educational institutions so that people who were forbidden from learning were able to now be educated, provided medical aid, negotiated labor contracts, because again, you had some people, many people who were not literate, who now had to contract for employment, as well as trying to obtain and retrieve the bonds for those veterans who served during the Civil War and were not being paid what was owed to them for their service. And so the Freedmen's Bureau was also tasked with assisting the newly freed and also our African-American veterans in getting monies and resources that were needed. Next slide, please. And so with the Freedmen's Bureau, what you have here before you is it was a political poster. There were a number of them that were posted up, and this was anti-Freedmen's Bureau. And what it states is the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man, twice vetoed by the president and made a law by Congress. If you support the Congress, you support the Negro. If you sustain the president, and you protect the white man. And so, you know, this program that was created was tasked with propaganda of having this, I guess, perception of you have a black man who is just laying back while you see white men working hard, tilling, chopping wood, and the pillars of that capital, where it says Freedmen's Bureau. The slide is going to be available, but it discusses like, well, they'll be able to they'll have white women. They'll be able to eat all the sweets and candy that they like and just sit back. And also there was the indication that the African-American troops and the Negro troops were being paid $300, whereas the white veterans were only paid $100. So again, to add some oil to the fire or fuel to the fire against the Freedmen's Bureau. Next slide, please. In late 1865 and early 1866, because the federal government was taken out, the states had independence. There were a number of Black codes, also known as Jim Crow laws, that were passed, which prevented Black people from owning or leasing land and forcing them to sign labor contracts with plantation owners or be arrested for vagrancy. These were created for the purpose of marginalizing African Americans by decreasing their chances to vote, hold jobs, own property, build prosperity, and or receive an education. It was interesting that a Black person could be arrested if they were caught in a group, caught without money, or saying that they were employed, but they were employed by an employer that was not recognized by other whites to be appropriate employment. Next, please, thank you.
So we will continue with economic moves and counter moves in the aftermath of the Civil War. In 1867, the Reconstruction Act, passed by Congress over veto by President Andrew Johnson, allowed Black people a voice in government, including election to Southern state legislatures and Congress. The Freedmen's Bank, pictured on the right, closed in 1874. The following video on the next slide tells the full story of the bank.
The creation of the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company, or the Freedmen's Bank as it became known, was a bold, even radical idea for its time. With the end of the Civil War in sight, a group of white Northern abolitionists, philanthropists, and business leaders met in New York in January 1865 to explore the formation of a permanent bank to help African American Civil War soldiers and the African American community. Having wages for the first time in their lives, newly emancipated men and women needed a safe place to deposit their earnings. On February 13, 1865, a bill to incorporate the Freedmen Savings and Trust Company was brought before Congress. Just 3 weeks later, President Abraham Lincoln signed the bill into law. The bank was crucial to help create opportunity for African Americans to build assets. It created a sense of protection for their money and welcomed them into the financial mainstream. Freedmen's Bank was a symbol of a stronger economic future for emancipated men and women at a key turning point in American history. 37 branch offices in 17 states in the District of Columbia were opened. In 1870, the bank's headquarters moved from New York to Washington, D.C. to the southeast corner of Lafayette Square, across the street from the White House at the Treasury Building. Most bank depositors were primarily low-wage earners, laborers, cooks, janitors, nurses, porters, seamstresses, and soldiers. But African American churches, businesses, schools, and other organizations also put their money in the bank. In addition, depositors included individuals who had been freed long before emancipation, such as physicians from Freedmen's Hospital, now Howard University Hospital, professors at Howard University, attorneys, and notables like Frederick Douglass, Captain O.S.B. Wall, and many others. It is estimated that over the 9-year life of the bank, approximately 100,000 individuals and institutions opened accounts with bank deposits totaling more than $57 million. That is equivalent to $115 billion today, based on its relative share of gross domestic product. During its first 5 years, Freedmen's Bank operated as a well-functioning institution. However, an amendment to the bank's charter led to risky asset investments. This, along with the lack of proper oversight, led to fraud, mismanagement, and abuse. In 1873, the United States experienced the financial panic, and Freedmen's Bank was not exempt from its impacts. Lack of confidence by the depositors led to runs on a bank that was already weakened. In 1874, Frederick Douglass was recruited to serve as the bank's president. He believed that the failing bank could be saved, and even invested his own money to revive it. But these efforts came too late. Freedmen's Bank closed its doors on the 29th of June, 1874. When it failed, depositors lost their savings. About half eventually received some of their money back. Others received nothing. It was a bitter conclusion to such a promising venture. The Freedmen's Bank building was sold and demolished in 1899, and in 1919, a new building that became the Treasury Annex was erected on the site. Despite its unfortunate end, the Freedmen's Bank embodied the hope for equality and inclusion in America's economic mainstream. Its legacy must be our continued quest for inclusive prosperity for every American.
So as we just saw in that video, the bank customers lost millions of dollars in deposits that created a distrust in the banks for many African Americans who had worked so hard to save their money and support the bank. In the 1870s, sharecropping became widespread as the freed African Americans are not given the land that was promised to them in 40 acres and a mule. Sharecropping, which was used by both white and Black families, they would rent small plots of land called shares from landowners, sometimes their former enslavers, trading their labor for a share of the crops they produced. They would often be unable to make enough money selling their crops and ended up with huge debts. While sharecropping gave poor farm laborers some autonomy in their daily work and social lives and freed them from the gang labor system that had dominated during the slavery era, it often resulted in sharecroppers owing more to the landowner for the use of tools and other supplies than they were able to repay. Some sharecroppers managed to acquire enough money to move from sharecropping to renting to owning land by the end of the 1860s, but many more went into debt and were forced by poverty or the threat of violence to sign unfair and exploitative sharecropping or labor contracts that left them little hope in improving their situations. Between 1866 and 1941, the use of convict leasing becomes widespread in the South. Black men, women, and children were arrested for no reason under Southern Black codes, and as convicts were leased against their will to labor camps and mines operated by private industry and state governments. We will be talking more about convict leasing and when we speak about the criminal justice system in one of our next sessions. Next slide. Now we're going to talk about a story of success followed by another counter move and the Tulsa Race Massacre. So in 1889, Ottawa W. Gurley, a Black educator, entrepreneur, and landowner born to former enslaved Africans, purchased a 40-acre tract that grows into the thriving Greenwood community in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Greenwood neighborhood consisted of prosperous Black-owned and built businesses, schools, churches, libraries, and beautiful homes, and was often referred to as Black Wall Street. In the video on the next slide, we will see actual footage from this community.
It's the roaring 20s. The country is flourishing. Some African-American communities are prospering, like the residents of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma. A remarkable Baptist pastor named Solomon Sir Jones is the pioneering filmmaker. His footage was lost for more than 50 years. Jones captures the bustling life of Greenwood, which could be any American small town. But Tulsa's whites don't like what they see. In May 1921, after a Black man is accused of assaulting a white woman, a white mob rampages through the city. For a night and a day, they loot and burn Greenwood. The Fox News crew captures the only surviving footage. It is the bloodiest racial massacre in American history, leaving nearly 300 dead.
And as you see, massacre survivors never received any assistance from the government to compensate for their losses.
The National Housing Act of 1934 was passed to provide home buying aid to Americans through federally subsidized loans, the FHA. It was a response to the New Deal and the Depression, to Roosevelt's New Deal. This assistance was limited almost entirely to white people, sadly, causing an increase in housing segregation in the country. To create barriers between white and Black neighborhoods, the practice of redlining began. Red lines were actually drawn on maps to label predominantly Black neighborhoods as hazardous, and you can see an example of a redlining map on the right. And the video on the next slide will explain more about redlining.
What is redlining? Redlining is a discriminatory lending practice denying access to federally backed mortgages and loans to certain communities based on race and ethnicity. It all started in the 1930s. During the housing crisis of the Great Depression, real estate moguls such as Springfield's Harry Kissel laid the groundwork for the National Housing Act of 1934. From this, a new federal agency was formed, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and with it, residential security maps that became the standard to determine the best places for housing investments. White communities with strong racially restricted deeds were given a grade A rating and identified as desirable for lending purposes, while Black communities, regardless of their economic status, were given a grade D rating and branded as hazardous and high risk. No federally backed loans were made there. Redlining locked out millions of Americans from accessing mortgages and stunted opportunities for Black families to build wealth to pass down to future generations. Although the practice of redlining was outlawed with the signing of the 1968 Fair Housing Act, the damage was done. Segregation was embedded in our cities and suburbs. Living in segregated communities has modern-day consequences, including sharp disparities in family wealth, education, and life expectancy. These maps were made more than 80 years ago, and yet they still tell a story that impacts us today, the story of redlining.
In 1944, the GI Bill was introduced to assist World War II veterans in obtaining home business loans and paying higher education expenses. It was a federally backed program, but administered locally by states. And very sadly, while white veterans were able to prosper under the benefits of this bill, most of the 900,000 Black veterans who had served their country were denied loans. They were denied admission to colleges by local officials, by bankers, and school administrators. Despite the Fair Housing Act of 1968, African Americans continue to experience discrimination when buying their homes. In our pre-session video, Senator Cory Booker describes the difficulty his own family experienced when purchasing their home.
We would also like to recognize the creation of Columbia in 1967. And this is a quote by James Rouse. "It is our hope that Columbia's policy as to race may be so clear and vivid from the beginning that it will be unmistakable to everyone." He further asked that the memo be distributed widely to the developer and sales agent staff members so that there can be no room for misunderstanding among us. He wrote this in 1967 before the Federal Fair Housing Act was enacted, establishing Columbia on the forefront of racial equity and inclusion from its very inception. This does not mean that Columbia was without its trouble. I heard a story that there was a builder who at the onset of Columbia was showing white and Black couples different streets in the village. So he would show all of the white couples one street and the Black couples a different street. And when Rouse heard of this, he decided that he could not continue working with this developer. So just like we've been speaking about this evening, where there were steps forward followed by steps backward, Columbia was not immune to that. On this slide, we talks about housing in Howard County. And if you note the percentages on the right, that Howard County is 19.3% African American and Black, and Columbia is 27%. Looking at home ownership in Howard County, 13.5% of homeowners are Black or African American, and 62% are white. Solely looking at the Black and African American population, you can see that 51% of Black and African Americans are homeowners in Columbia. These numbers might be better than the national average, but there still is a lot of work to do.
So this chart zooms in on recent years on the relative average net worth trend lines for Black versus white Americans. The wealth gap, as you see here, was relatively flat from 1989 through 1995. But then wealth begins to grow for both Black and white families through 1996 through 2007. Though not quite at the same rate, but approximately the same. Beyond 2007, however, after the recession, the gap starts to widen again. And there's a slight uptick, though, that in Black net worth from 2013 through 2016. But again, that curve flattens out after that point, such that by 2019, the total net worth, or the average net worth of white families in the US was 6.8 times the average net worth of Black families. Part of that small uptick we saw in Black family average net worth after the 2006-2008 recession was driven by specific steps taken to support and strengthen the overall US economy, which also benefited African American communities. That included the creation of 3.7 million private sector jobs. Taxes were cut for working families, and unemployment insurance was improved to keep 1.4 million African Americans out of poverty. And the new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was created to prevent mortgage companies, credit card lenders, and payday loan companies from exploiting consumers with hidden fees and other deceptive practices. The CFPB also enforced fair lending laws to protect African Americans from discriminatory lending practices, for example, subprime loans. Despite these moves, however, the wealth gap did not close. There are currently approximately 46.9 million African Americans in the US today. They represent about 12.4% of the US population. And 65% of this population is concentrated in 16 states, as indicated on the right side of the slide you're seeing here. And those states are highlighted. You'll notice that there is migration that has occurred from the southern states, where the major African American populations originated. This migration actually started in 1910 and continued through 1970 in two waves. In the first wave, about 3 million moved to northern states like Illinois, Michigan, New York, as well as Ohio and Pennsylvania for work opportunities in manufacturing and services sectors, especially as driven by automobile manufacturing, and of course, wartime manufacturing in supports of World War I and World War II. After World War II, there was a second migration out of the South, again, looking for better job opportunities. In addition to the states shown here, there was migration to California, Oregon, and Washington State. After 1970, though, many US manufacturing jobs moved offshore, and there was a corresponding and a significant impact on manufacturing job opportunities for Black Americans. Basically, the openings that were available in the manufacturing sector went to white Americans rather than Black Americans. This chart clearly shows that despite equivalent levels of education, median household net worth is significantly less for Black versus white families. Black Americans have disproportionately suffered compared to their white counterparts due to, first of all, lower salaries for similar work, reduced access to housing in growth areas, for example, as due to redlining, as we previously discussed, lack of available and stable job opportunities in their communities, and finally, a history of economic inequities, which reduced legacy wealth transfers between generations, which included the distrust of banking institutions, the destruction of Wall Street, for example, and other prosperous Black communities as we've gone through so far. But a significant difference you see in terms of net worth for education versus education.
There was a long research that was conducted actually by members from Duke University, and the research looked at the issue of closing the racial wealth gap. And there are about 10 popular suggestions that are made as a remedy to closing the racial wealth gap. And in the study, which is you'll find the link to the 67 pages in the resources or the resource slides that we have. It goes through each of these myths, or they indicate them as being myths. And I'll just kind of summarize what has been written from various studies and surveys. So the first myth is that African Americans should achieve greater educational goals and they should work harder. Well, the slide that Terry had just gone over, if you were to focus on African Americans versus white Americans with postgraduate degrees, white Americans, on average, they have about $455,000 wealth versus African Americans, we have $141,000 in wealth. And so when you have people who are postgraduates and then looking at the occupations and the jobs and the pay, says that's not going to be the only thing that's going to truly close the racial wealth gap. The second is the gap in home ownership drives the racial wealth gap. And the critique is that what is the word drives? It actually shows that non-home owners who are white are still 31 times as wealthier than non-home owners who are Black. And when we talk about wealth, it's not just salary, it's also assets. And so we have to think about that in those terms, and assets are, in America, our largest assets, usually for most of us, is our home. Number three is supporting Black-owned businesses and banks, and if you support Black-owned businesses and you bank with Black-owned financial institutions, that would also contribute to closing the gap. It kind of seems like a separate but equal fixer or suggestion. But in 2016, the federal Black Enterprise indicated that the top 100 Black-owned firms collected a gross of $24 billion and employed 73,940 workers, in contrast with Walmart, which is the top firm in the United States, which grossed more than 20 times as much and employed 2.2 million more workers. And so, the fact that Walmart, being the largest private employer in the United States, generates revenue in the manner which it does, whereas 2.58 million Black-owned businesses combined, Walmart generates more revenue than the 2.58 million Black-owned businesses combined. Top 5 Black-owned banks have $2 million combined in assets, whereas JP Morgan has $2 trillion. And also JP Morgan, I guess the companies that then formed JP Morgan were involved in providing life insurance policies to enslaved people, which created assets that they have. Fourth is Black people need to save more. Data shows that African Americans save on par with white Americans, but African Americans have less of 401k and investment portfolios, but savings are usually at the same rate given the same opportunity. Greater financial literacy would close the racial wealth gap. Again, home ownership being a primary asset, and there are more resources to invest and to build more assets that whites have than Blacks. African Americans primarily invest in their homes and not have the resources to spread the investments. Entrepreneurship is more Black entrepreneurs. Now, there are 90% of Black-owned businesses do not have more employees than the owners themselves. A study in 2010 indicated that for white businesses to start their business, it was an average of $106,000 in capital was used, whereas for African-American owned businesses was like $35,000 in capital that would that these entrepreneurs had to start their own businesses. Also, more recently, there is data regarding the PPP rollout and how we had to have a second rollout because African-American business and also minority-owned businesses were kind of left out. Number 7 is emulating successful minorities. Again, we're just saying, okay, you have Oprah, you have, Shaquille O'Neal, you have Magic Johnson. Well, if you get more people like that, then, that will close the racial wealth gap. You have Jay-Z. The fact of the matter is that, having those figures are not going to really affect the overall racial wealth gap. Improving soft skills, and that is, kind of making, if Black people were more employable in the sense, actually it's kind of built around stereotypes in the sense of, if an African-American was more prompt in employment, or if, they build more interpersonal skills, kind of assuming that, Black people are always late for work, or, they're rude to customers and such. But also it ignores the fact that when we talk about wealth gap, we're talking about being able to transfer wealth throughout generations. Again, the number of celebrities indicated, if you, of course, with the celebrities, you should be able to close the racial wealth gap, but still the median Black family net worth was $17,600. This is in 2016 versus $170,000 for white Americans. And the last is the Black disorganization contributes to the racial wealth gap. And I mean, studies are very clear that any one parent family system or household, there is less wealth, and that's across racial lines. But it's basically, if you were to look at a study that was in 2013, even when you have a 2-parent household with 2-parent households, the wealth by age as well as by gender, there is still a gap of at least 3-fold. So please review that, review that study that was published in 2018 as in addition to all of the other references that we have here. We've tried to provide facts that are sourced, and so the footnotes provide the resources. Now we're going to break out into our discussion sessions. We'll have our facilitators start off with some questions. Please remember to be open and to allow other people the space and opportunity to speak. And we'll see you on the other end. I don't know, how many groups were there?
6.
There were 6. Okay, all right. So, and I just want to do a program time check. So we have about 15 minutes because we want to be respectful of everyone's time. And we could take a couple of minutes and maybe if we can have a facilitator just share, actually, I'm just going to have 3 and then we can talk about maybe some actions or that we can take. Let's see, can we have 3 facilitators raise their hand? And let's see, Mark, would you like to share? And Peggy and Dave, you can share. And let's see, who else were our facilitators? I can't see.
Julie.
Julie has raised her hand.
Okay. All righty.
All right.
So Mark,
I'll
want to start?
Okay. the one thing that really jumped out at us, one of our members pointed out a big gap in the nursing industry, nurses with master's degrees, how the basically people that are white nurses with master's degrees, there's actually data in a study that shows that they make much more money than somebody that is Black with the same master's degree in nursing.
Gosh.
And this is today. And so, in various jobs, you're definitely seeing, disparity in what people are being paid to do the same job with the same background. Over.
Thank you. But Julie?
Yeah, the thing that I wanted to mention is that, the members in my group, we all were aware that there was a racial gap. Some had a little more background in that, but a lot of the history is really absent in our education system. People aren't taught any of this. It's been skimmed over. So you have to go looking for it, right? You have to get to college and you have to go looking for it, but it's never taught. And so how are we to learn and grow if we don't even know that this is what was happening in the past, this is what's happening now.
Right. It's like, how do you learn and grow if you don't know, right? Marge, were you a facilitator? You're on mute.
I was not. I was in Mark's group.
Oh, okay. Liz?
I think you called out Peggy and
I'm gonna get. Yeah, I was looking at my time, so yeah.
Okay.
But thank you. Yeah.
Yes, our group had a lot of anger as their emotion, and they spoke about the time of Reconstruction and what could have been.
Thank you. Peggy and Dave?
Yeah, so we had a number of emotional responses to some of the material, and it was on one hand, the back and forth, the whiplash, some good news up, then some bad news, and then some good news, and some bad news, but ultimately it's the overall shock of the reality of what was offered, what was promised, and those promises that were never kept, and or so rarely kept. That was a real shock, and it kind of underpinned, I think, the emotional response of the team. And ultimately, where would we be today if we had been able to do things differently? If we had not had so much of the 2 steps back and just kept the 1 step forward motion going? Such a wasted opportunity for so many. Not for only the Black people, but for our whole country. Anyway. Then we talked, about the obstacles and just acknowledge the breadth and width of all of the obstacles. And, there's just so many opportunities that the Blacks have been blocked from. It's education, it's work, it's home ownership, and it's just the ability to live free of incarceration. There's just so many different ways that it struck me and me, so maybe others, that it's hard to imagine that it's not systemic racism. It's everywhere you turn, there's some obstacle that's confronting the Black community at large. And then in the end, we came back to the idea of, well, is it better today? Is it maybe things are turning around? We're seeing a lot more diversity, maybe in the workplace, right? But then there's also so many other examples that if you look for them, you can see where it's not better today. There's still systematic racism at play, at work, that needs to be erased. The incarceration is certainly just one example of many.
Right. Which we'll be discussing, right? So we have about 9 minutes. I wanted us to go to the slide where we can discuss some action, possibly that we can take. As as Donna had indicated in during the slide on the GI Bill, and what had taken place and how African American veterans were left out, that Reverend Senator Warnock has presented the passage of the GI Bill Restoration Act, and so possibly, of course, writing a letter to Congress in support of it. That's something that we can do. Although, you know, the Black-owned businesses, I indicated, was like the myth, but it still assists, right, in the local community. And so those myths, I wanted to reiterate that they were like the singular response or the singular solution, right? And so that's kind of like, well, that one thing is not going to do it. That one thing is not going to do it. And so, and when I say do it, that's close the racial wealth gap. And also educating, right, as you know, Julie reported from her group, you know, if you don't know, you can't grow. And so educating ourselves and being the people that we, you know, would like to have other people emulate, and sharing and having these hard, honest conversations. And now that we're educated, try and educate others. Does anyone else have any other suggestions? I can't see if we can stop sharing. I can't see to call on anyone. Thank you so much, Scott. Janet, Ms. Jenkins?
Yeah. I always like to think about education, because in my family, and I know it's true in so many families, that was the key to any significant changes in economic status. But as we talked about a little bit toward the end of the group I was in, education, especially higher education, is becoming more and more out of the reach of most people, and especially if you're already poor to start. So I think a list like that needs to include some attention to that. Here in Maryland, there was legislation passed that's to have a significant difference in the public schools. Well, not just in the public school system, but and it's going to be, of course, it's at the state level to start, but it's going to be rolled out all the way down to the community level. So I've been trying to find out about it. It's very difficult for some reason. I've even called the school board and talked to more than one person, but I'm going to keep trying, and I encourage other people to look into that. I'm blanking on the name of the legislation now. To try to do what you can. You know, it's like the story of the man walking along the seashore and picking up and throwing back the starfish that he can. And someone asked him, you know, well, you can't save them all. Well, if you can save even a few, it'll make a difference to them. And then hopefully the ripple effect will help. So if you can reach out and help in some way, and the improvement of this, I know everybody has heard that school to prison pipeline, that's an area that really needs looking into, because so many Black kids are pulled out of the school system and end up in the penal system for minor infringements a lot of times that just don't happen to white people. So long story short, I think education advocacy needs to be on a list like that in some form or other. Mm-hmm.
And Marge, we have Marge.
Sorry. Yeah, I was going to say, and I think another thing we can do is confront stereotypes when we hear them, when we see them, because I mean, people will just toss in something, and if no one confronts them, it's like, oh yeah, you know, that's the way it is. That's, those people are like that, and you know, no, that's not been my experience. That's not, you know, accurate, and I think that kind of confronts people, so they're like, oh, you know, I have to take another look at that, and that I think makes a difference.
Yes.
Well, thank you. Maria, did you want to share something?
Well, there is one stereotype that comes to mind. This you always hear about that white people say black on black violence. And I'm thinking, what's with white on white violence? You know, it's like, you know, you look at a place where many Black people live and then pretend that's only their problem. So yeah, I think that's, you know, breaking through stereotypes when necessary.
Thank you very much. I wanted to just reiterate that the work for not just this presentation, but all of the other two presentations and the future presentations, the subgroups really worked hard in gathering information, and our goal really was to present objective facts, right? They could be objectionable, but objective facts, right? We tried to kind of stay away from opinion, and really we just wanted to provide information that was based in history. Like I call it the story, right? The story. And so you can really go down a rabbit hole, and I welcome you to do that with all of the resources that are listed. And so if we can, do that, because again, educating ourselves and educating others, but there was a lot of I'm sorry, I'm looking at chats as they pop in. But again, if we could just continue with our own education, but I really wanted to again extend my appreciation to Donna, Terry, and Liz, who truly worked so hard in gathering all the resources, and also trying to really maintain to be objective in this emotional, stirring topic. And so I know, Janet, we're about to close with a prayer. I didn't know if you wanted to, was your hand up again, or where are you? Okay. Ms. Jenkins?
No, I'm writing in the chat. I didn't put my hand.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Do we want to mention the Peace Walk that's an action?
Sure.
I don't know if Scott's there, but if not, the parish is organizing a bus to go and participate in a peace walk with our sister parish, Bernardines, on next Monday, Martin Luther King Day. We've done that in the past. We've walked to sites close to the parish where people have died in the past year through gun violence. And it's been a wonderful opportunity to fraternize, to be in solidarity with our sister parish in the city. And I think Scott has information online, an invitation from our sister parish. I would really encourage everybody who's concerned about racial equity and solidarity across racial divides to try and participate in that next Monday.
Thank you. Liz, are you going
Thumbs already
to?
up.
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you.
I'm the evangelist in Columbia, and I'm here today to invite you to our upcoming Peace Walk in honor of Martin Luther King Jr. and our former pastor, Edward Miller. The walk will occur on Martin Luther King Day, which is Monday, January 16th. We'll start at 12 o'clock noon with a prayer service. And after the prayer service, we will walk through our neighborhood to visit areas where there have been incidences of violence. We will pray for the victims. We will pray for our neighborhood. And then we will return to the church and share a light lunch with each other. St. John's has participated in this often in the past, and we look forward to the opportunity to sharing this time together. Our guest speaker in the prayer service this year is Dr. Daria Willis. She's the first African-American president of Howard Community College, and we're looking forward to listening to her words and her reflections on the life of Dr. Martin Luther King and his impact on her life and the service that she has offered to the community. So we hope that you'll be able to join us. We hope that you will keep us in your prayers, and we look forward together to being instruments of peace.
I've been getting paid $1,000 a month, if not more, just from this app on my phone. And I don't know if you can see this. But
So
it's-
can we return to the prayer, please, Scott, so Liz can close us out in our prayer? Thank you so much.
All right, so again, we ask you to mute your microphones and join us in our closing prayer from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. O Lord our God, in your mercy and kindness, no thought of ours is left unnoticed, no desire or concern ignored. You have proven that blessings abound when we fall on our knees in prayer, and so we turn to you in our hour of need. Surrounded by violence and cries for justice, we hear your voice telling us what is required. Only to do justice and to love goodness and to walk humbly with your God. Fill us with your mercy so that we in turn may be merciful to others. Strip away pride, suspicion, and racism so that we may seek peace and justice in our communities. Strengthen our hearts so that they beat only to the rhythm of your holy will. Flood our path with your light as we walk humbly toward a future filled with encounter and unity. Be with us, O Lord, in our efforts, for only by the prompting of your grace can we progress toward virtue. We ask this through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
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 We hope that you join us for our upcoming sessions, HCAR, Honest Conversations About Racism 2.0 sessions. The next is February 1st, which we will be dealing and discussing education. So possibly we may touch on some of what Ms. Jenkins had introduced to us. The April 12th healthcare session, we might have a change in date. We probably will have a change in date as it's conflicted with another one of our outreach groups from the parish, and we want everyone to be able to continue with their own learning. And so we might change that date. And then the 3rd of May, we have the session on criminal justice system. So still, please stay tuned. We'll have it on the website, on the parish's website, and it'll be in flock notes to come. And thank you. Liz has placed in the chat a link to our survey. Please fill out the survey, even now that it's fresh in your mind. We as a group, we come together, we review it and review them, and we try to figure out how we can make things better. So on behalf of the Racial Justice Committee of St. John's Parish, thank you so much for joining us. And you'll see the scroll of references. Again, the presentation is going to be recorded, it has been recorded, and the slides are going to be available on the parish website. So thank you so much for your time and your spirit with us this evening, and you all have a great rest of your evening.